Hi guys, welcome to the History of Alchemy. I'm Travis Dow, creator of the show and host of some history podcasts, including the History of Alchemy Podcast. So if you want to see what these videos will be about, go to thehistoryofalchemy.com, or just keep watching. Many history podcasters helped out to make this happen, and instead of just animating myself or other podcasters, I'll animate the characters we discuss. This is pretty cool though. Angry face. I'm so happy. Anyway. So, for example, let's have Zosimos of Panopolis take it from here. Alright, here we go. Now, Zosimos was an alchemist from the 4th century in Alexandria, and there's a good reason why alchemy is best looked at in historical context. Alchemy existed for some, 1400 years, and it came to be independently in China, India, and also Egypt at around the same time. And they had some little similarities, but the main focus of this show is the Western tradition of alchemy, starting in Ptolemaic Egypt and ending in Europe in the 18th century. So let's get started with the history of alchemy. The history of alchemy spanned at least 1400 years in Europe and the Middle East. Alchemy has a murky history that changed over time. It's also a part of the history of science. Let's look at what it was and how the world changed through the history of alchemy. So, what is this show exactly? This didn't exactly come out of a vacuum, and if I'm slow in putting these out, there are other alchemy sources out there from us. This History of Alchemy started as a podcast, and before that, answering questions on the Ask Historians subreddit. The podcast started in February 2013. Pete Coleman and I started the History of Alchemy podcast and the Bohemican podcast, a Czech history podcast, at the same time. There's a reason. We both lived in Prague. Prague in the Czech Republic is today the most awesome city in the world. And at one point in history was also the very center of the alchemical world. Prague was the place to be an alchemist during the golden age of alchemy. Prague was a sort of crossroads to alchemists and was well known. The Golden Lane was built in the time of Rudolf II. Rudolf II. Rudolf II gets a lot of mention in the podcast, mainly because during the Golden Age of Alchemy, you wanted to be close to the Emperor. Rudolf II was Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He was a Habsburg, and he was batshit insane. Paintings, stared at him, hallucinated. There's a reason why I chose to animate this painting, actually. See his episode on thehistoryofalchemy.com for much more on him. And he was an alchemist himself that got his hands dirty, and also made Prague the capital of the Holy Roman Empire. To be a court alchemist under Rudolf II, or at least get his patronage in Bohemia, meant job security, though rarely riches, and actually usually death. Batshit insane. Rudolph was guano. He was guano. What I would do differently if I ever started the podcast over. And now I sort of have that chance. The podcast has been a great way to come in contact with like-minded people who love the history of science, and also people that are interested in the history of the occult and magic, which is exactly why I picked alchemy as a field to really delve deeper into. Now I can take all the experience of listener feedback through email, Facebook, Twitter, comments, carrier pigeon, and use all of that when doing these videos. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that it's actually pretty hard for everyone to agree on a definition of alchemy. But I got you covered. But hold on, let me get back to Zosamos. Alchemy is the pursuit of the philosopher's stone. All alchemists had that in common in the Western tradition. But the philosopher's stone means different things to different people and has throughout history, even to different alchemists. The most common definition is the philosopher's stone as an enabler when transmutating metals, like lead and copper, into metals like silver and gold. Even within that definition, it could have been a stone, it could have been gold so pure it purifies other metals into gold, it could have been powder, sometimes red, and maybe it also had the ability to extend life, and in this form it might be the elixir of life. Elixir is an alchemical term, from Arabic meaning from the ashes. To some, the elixir and the philosopher's stone are the same thing. We have a connection and confusion, sort of, between the two. Some believed gold had healing powers, not just in the Middle East, but Chinese alchemy held this as truth too. But to some, they were different things. There is an important connection between the history of medicine and alchemy. And as medicine is the child of philosophy, alchemy is the grandchild. So we also get the idea of transmutating a sick body into a healthy one. And a quick poll of alchemists will tell you that all of them believed in the supernatural, even if some shunned it. It's therefore not hard to imagine an idea of a transmutation of a corrupt soul of sin to a redeemed and enlightened soul, a sort of spiritual alchemy. But caution, the term spiritual alchemy is a very difficult one to use. Before I go through the history of alchemy in a very brief summary, let me make one note about the occult revival. Alright, so a couple of things I wanted to mention regarding historical bias and specifically the occult revival and everything that comes after is just to note the difference between primary sources and secondary sources and tertiary sources. And there's a lot of examples in alchemy where there's not all that many great primary sources, but there's just hundreds, if not thousands, of secondary sources of eyewitnesses of the Philosopher's Stone or transmutating gold, but no credible ones, not a single one. So, like the Count of Saint Germain, we have eyewitness accounts of conversations between him and somebody else that was way too old to have remembered him, meaning that he must have lived 200 years or more. But he didn't. He just didn't. Arnold of Villanova is another one. In fact, Nicholas Flamel is a famous example of an alchemist who didn't get his reputation as an alchemist until about 200 years after his death. So, you know, alchemy changed through history. The way that people saw alchemy in the past also changed throughout history. And it changed in the Renaissance. It changed when it came to Europe in the 13th century, and then, you know, obviously again in the Renaissance, and it changed in the early modern period. And every time was because of some beliefs that changed, or they wanted to separate themselves from something in the past, and so alchemy changed according to the times. Now here's what I'm not. I'm not a skeptic. I'm not trying to debunk anything. But we'll do some videos about some of the facts or myths about alchemy in the history. And the fact is that real alchemists existed, and some really believed in magic, and therefore some alchemical recipes had elements of sympathetic magic, which is why I'll do an episode on Cornelis Agrippa, for instance, and along with the Kabbalah or Christian Kabbalah in the Renaissance, and much more, like astrology and Hermeticism and Neoplatonism. All that stuff has come up before in the podcast, and we've done episodes on them in the podcast. And anything that kind of works its way into alchemical recipes will end up in the video as well. But alchemists were some of the very first chemists, and also groundbreaking astronomers and doctors. And alchemists drove science forward through optics and control systems and the discovery of all kinds of compounds and even elements. So there are two sides to this coin, and luckily I like looking at both sides of them. So what does 1400 years of history look like? Well, that was always very hard to get a grip on for a podcast, but maybe I can quite easily show you a summary here now. And there's no one better to give us the rundown than the author of our oldest extant primary source for alchemy, Zosimos of Panopolis. Ptolemaic Egypt, 4th century AD Alexandria. Cesspool of all kinds of ideas, alchemists, and then Eastern Christians like Nestorian Christians and Jews took alchemy to Persia, translated it to Arabic, where many added Arabic commentaries during the Islamic Golden Age. And then people like Ramon Lull got their hands on it. And in the Crusades and in the reconquest of Spain and even the fall of Constantinople, it started to spread through Europe. But even before then, monks started to get their hands on it and started to trickle through, even through the Byzantine Empire. But with the reconquest of Spain and the fall of Constantinople, alchemy had definitely arrived in Europe. The Renaissance alchemy had a revival along with magic and the occult, and was again mixed up with it. This time with Kabbalah, a new brand of Neoplatonism, and Hermetic revival. And so, it wasn't always welcome, just as it had not always been welcome everywhere in the Middle East. Some popes had banned it, as did kings and emperors. But some popes and emperors then secretly hired their own court alchemists to have a sort of monopoly. Some were even alchemists themselves, like Rudolf II in the Golden Age of alchemy. I should say this is what's commonly known as the early modern period, as in Rudolf II. So the early modern period equals the Golden Age of alchemy equals around 1600. But just one generation later would be the beginning of the end of alchemy. The tools of alchemy began to be used for other purposes than just the search for the philosopher's stone. This started happening almost immediately, actually, but like distillation is one of those alchemical processes that you should thank every time you enjoy a mojito or vodka Red Bull or whatever the kids these days are drinking. But beginning after the 30 Years' War and on into the Age of Enlightenment, these tools started to be used as ways to test hypotheses of the people who were curious about much more than just how to make gold, or living forever, or artificial life. Oh yeah, did I mention homunculi? They are gross little artificial people. I'll do an episode on them. Alchemists did that too. But anyway, now people were interested in everything around them. And chemistry, as we know it, to be born as alchemy started to really get an irredeemably bad reputation. Chemistry was built on the principles of conservation of mass, while alchemy thought like the metal theory, like the composition of metal was made up of sulfur and mercury and could be changed with certain minerals like salt minerals. And matter in general was changeable because the four elements, you just had earth, air, fire, and water, and basically you break them down and then you build them back up in a different ratio. Maybe throw in some quintessence there as a fifth element. But why did alchemists believe that turning lead into gold was possible? Well, empirical evidence. But okay, some of the most interesting alchemists had one foot in both worlds, like Tycho Brahe or Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was very late to the party, but he was not alone. And for me, the end of alchemy comes with the publication of John Bolton's atomic theory. I have to pick a date somewhere, so I picked the one that's close to the turn of the 19th century. So that's the end of the history of alchemy as a mainstream sort of proto-science. But it did live on. Now, before we wrap up the show, let's look at a message from an affiliated history podcast, shall we? The term secret cabinet comes from the historic artifacts locked away in museums and kept from the general public. Honestly, that's probably where they belong. But someone decided to dig around in those secret cabinets and present what he found to the world. This show comes from the deviant, clearly deranged, and probably dangerous mind of Der Buddler. He hosts the original German show, as well as a German archaeological podcast called Angegraben. And now, very tastefully, and not in any vulgar way, I translate this show to English and carefully bring you topics like the graffiti of Pompeii, the history of pornography, Marquise de Sade's mother-in-law, Emperor Norton, people kept in zoos, the history of stink, chastity belts, murder dolls, and many other off-topic topics. Come find us on Facebook and Twitter. Give the podcast a good review or rating. And don't forget to subscribe. And we're back. Don't forget to check out the Secret Cabinet Facebook page and rate it on iTunes. Now, spiritual alchemy, part of alchemy, is kind of stronger than ever, in fact. And spagyric alchemy, like herbal alchemy, is alive and thriving. And alchemy is sort of making a big comeback in the 21st century. Even the kind of academic, historic research in alchemy is making a big comeback and has been for the last few decades. There are neat science experiments that can be done that come straight out of alchemical, works and recipes. Anyways, this is a series. There will be another video, but these take a while to make. In the meantime, if you want to know much, much, much more about the history of alchemy, go visit historyofalchemy.com. And with Pete Coleman, we talk about over 50 alchemists and also concepts, many of which I'll turn into videos eventually. But for now, a lot of that information is also available on the website. And I'm working on cranking that out in book format, which is a great way to support the shows if you go to Amazon and buy the History of Alchemy book called Alchemy Booklet. Anyways, stop by podcastnik.com for the rest of the podcasts I'm involved in. Bohemican, more about Prague, the Secret Cabinet, History of Germany podcast. Find the History of Alchemy podcast through podcastnik.com as well. Next time, the first alchemist we have a written manuscript from is Zosimus of Panopoulos, but he writes about those that come before him. Miriam the Jewess, Miriam the prophetess, and Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes, or the Egyptian god Thoth. And to understand even later alchemy, we need to take a look at the Hermeticism which is bound up in its roots. Even Isaac Newton translated Hermes Trismegistus's Emerald Tablet. Next time, on episode 2, Before Zosimos.